Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. So yeah, we can start now. Yeah, so I've been really interested in this economist, really important figure named Lynn Ostrom that I've probably told you guys all about multiple times on the WhatsApp. And I've been trying to find some concrete parallels and bridges from this theory of organization we've been developing to like actual what might be called the institutional analysis or political economic analysis in this like more traditional economic sense, right? Not like the Marxist tradition, but kind of this microeconomic sense of game theory and so on. And I think there's something really promising. And so I titled this presentation Treating the Commons because, as you know, Badiou has this concept of treating points, which is probably to me, one of his most kind of intriguing ideas. All right, there's some connection with some very high level mathematics, right? Toposes and so on. Like the notion of a point is not trivial, right? It's very, there's a lot behind it on the one hand. On the other hand, treating points, he doesn't talk about it very much, but it seems like that is his updated version of what in being an event would be called like creating like new connections in a situation, right? So like if you recall in being an event, you have the kind of default connection of belonging that kind of orders the world. Sets belong to each other, but Badiou develops this other kind of alternate type of connection that relates to the procedures and so on. So he imports this into the language of logics of worlds as points. So we can go further in that direction and try to also talk about forcing and so on, forcing over sheaves. So there's this whole area there that's very, very, very interesting and dense. But without going to that formalism, I think the basic idea of the point is that there are decisions that you make in a world which reveal parts of the world that previously were obscured or kind of ambiguous, right? So if you think about the logic, a world itself, it's not just like what is available in that moment, but a world is something that's constantly unfolding depending on the decisions that you make. So I wanted to draw a parallel between that and Lynn Ostrom's notion of the commons. So before we continue, we should know what is Lynn Ostrom's definition of the commons. So she defines in her major work in the 1990 book governing the commons, she calls it a common pool resource, right? That's the main topic of the work. And it refers to a natural or man-made resource system that is sufficiently large as to make it costly, but not impossible to exclude potential beneficiaries from obtaining benefits from its use. Basically, what that means is it's a resource that, because by virtue of the resource itself, you cannot stop others from benefiting from it, right? It's something about it is irreducibly common. And this has been a topic in economics for a long time. It's kind of you could think of it as a limit of traditional economic thought, because it always leads to a kind of a paradox, because if you think of individuals as rational actors, that try to maximize some measure of utility. The commons are kind of the point at which the individual benefits deviate from the benefits of the whole, right? So cooperative versus kind of selfish or individual gains, right? Or to use like the game theory language, the commons are where the Pareto optimal solutions deviate from the Nash equilibrium solutions, right? Pareto optimal being allocations which maximize the benefits to everyone, and Nash equilibrium being what is the best option for me, knowing that everyone else's strategy, right? What everyone else will do. So, okay, so we have this basic idea of what the commons are.
And just one thing, man. Like it's interesting that the commons are defined. It looks like the system versus environment distinction we've been playing with, because it's defined as something that is too costly to turn into a private property, right?
Yes.
It's too costly to enclose it. Like usually things are more economic if you turn them into a private property, because then you can benefit from it, right?
Yeah.
So it's I don't know, it has a bit of that flavor of being defined by cost constraints, not being defined by some substantial inwardly quality, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That you could say that the thing that makes it irreducibly common is also the thing that makes it like it is always the environment for your system. I mean, you can try to make it, let's say, its own system within, let's say, the capitalist environment, but something about it will exceed that system, right? And we know in economics, there's the term like externality, right? Negative externalities, things that are not counted by the cost structure of let's say capitalist firms, right? You can basically like do a cost accounting of everything that a firm pays for and everything that the firm makes as income. But what is left out is this common, these negative externalities, right? So pollution would be an example, waste, climate change, obviously. These are all negative externalities that are not counted in any particular system. They just they're like free floating. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense to say that it's like system versus environment. Environment is something like the space of things that are not counted in that sense. Okay, so based on this, I wanted to everything I was saying earlier, I think it's summarized into this syllogism, which is Ray Badiouin. So 1, a body is that which investigates or treats the logical and spatial structure of the world. Okay, so again, we have this world. It's not completely revealed what it is, right? It has some structure. And in order to kind of reach the border of the world and see what's at that border, you have to make certain decisions. And when you make those decisions, you see a little bit further. The world begins to unfold, and the body is the vehicle that does that, right? The second point of the syllogism is that the commons are the site of this structure for the political economic world. So the site is kind of this thing, think of it as like everything that's kind of not counted in the ways that we slice up the world in terms of predicates. So every world has a set of predicates. These predicates kind of delimit the boundaries of the world and what is kind of sayable about the world. And the site is this opaque region in which, there are predicates on the site, but there's something opaque about these predicates, right? They're kind of, you could think of them as kind of tautological or not really covering everything that's going on. There's some novelty that's possible in these regions. So the commons feels like that, right? Because like we were saying, there's something irreducibly about them, like irreducibly environmental, let's say, about them, that even if you were to slice up the commons in different ways, right? Usually in terms of price, let's say, like if you try to price everything about a commons, so you say, like, just think of something simple like a lake or a body of water that's shared by a lot of people. You can try to like cut it up into different parts of the lake and say, like, okay, this part of the lake is worth this much amount of money. This part of the lake's worth this much. The fish inside are worth this much. And that would be like the set of predicates, right? But something remains kind of not counted in that process. So that's why I'm saying it's a site. And then finally, the subjectivized body investigates or treats the commons point by point. So if we're trying to investigate the political economic world, it makes sense that we need to kind of make our investigation fit these commons, right? It's not like the body just investigates anything it wants. If it's in a political economic world, it needs to somehow connect these commons or something about these commons. And then all the stuff we talked about before about constraints makes sense here as well. Like, what are constraints on a body? They are constraints having to do with these commons. But here I want to, because we had talked about in the last meeting, the difference between like a natural constraint, let's say like the amount of fish in a lake, which that is a constraint on, let's say, the community that needs to survive from that lake, right? There is some constraint coming from nature to, let's say, like the social world. But there's also this political constraints that have to do, I would say, more to do with things like the right to access, the right to use, like who gets the right to use these resources. And here, yeah, I think we're more in that Badiou territory of political constraints. Okay, but this is kind of a very high level view of it. Okay, so earlier I was saying that the commons form a kind of limit point for economics, and you can kind of see that in this kind of four names here: Aristotle, Hobbes, Ansel Olsen, Garrett Hardin. Each of them have at different points talked about the commons as this place where you basically, inevitably, the commons gets degraded, right? If you leave individuals to their selfish ends, they will each use the commons up, and basically it seems impossible that you can have a cooperation, except obviously we know throughout history that cooperation does happen. And part of Lynn Ostrom's work is to say this very nice thing, which is like, okay, so if under the traditional game theoretic framework, it makes no sense to cooperate around the commons. Like, every commons should undergo what's called the tragedy of the commons, right? It should be degraded, or overused, or overfished, overgrazed. But we know from many examples, many communities have figured out ways to cooperate and achieve a certain optimal outcome that is not the outcome of a game theory puzzle, like the prisoner's dilemma, right? So yeah, we kind of talked about this in a previous meeting, like months ago, probably a year ago, where we talked about prisoner's dilemma as this minimal example of how the Pareto optimal and the Nash equilibrium solutions deviate, right? So basically, tragedy of commons is when you take that scenario and apply it to any common situation. So we're all the prisoners if we degrade the commons, because in the end we lose out by not cooperating. But at the same time, you don't want to let other people free ride off of your work. So you get this situation where for your self-interest, it's better to not cooperate.
Would you say that I guess the difficulty of like dealing with the commons well is that the benefits of it, like still at the individual level, exist in some kind of like weird counterfactual space?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah,
where it's like I guess you can never like quantify it while you're outside of, like, while you're not benefiting from it in the first place. I don't know.
I think that Hardin's example is very good to clarify how they see the problem, because he says when you're sharing resources, what happens is that benefits are individual and costs are shared over the whole pool of people. So, for example, if there's a pasture many people use, the benefit of me adding more cattle to my farm is augmented by augmenting, like my benefits augment in a proportion the more cattle I have, but the negative consequence of the overgrazing, I think that's called, right?
Yeah.
It's actually shared amongst everyone. So I only get a share of the negative, right? The negative effect divided by everyone who's using. I don't get the full negative effect, not individual. So there's a mismatch between the incentive to think about myself and use it in my favor, and the negative effects are actually mediated by everyone, something like that, right?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and you can see how it doesn't take much to take that description and make it into this phenomenological thing, right? It's basically like you can sense benefits in the sense of when you're in the commons, you can sense your benefits, you perceive them, they're very immediate, but you can't sense the cost as much because of the costs have a minimal existence, right? They're like kind of distributed in a weird way, maybe like, I mean, clearly in the sense of like climate change and these really big examples, the costs are very unevenly distributed as well, right? You can kind of, in certain parts of the world, just ignore it completely. But yeah, I think the counterfactual is important there, because I think it requires you to think about what others will do as well.
Yeah.
Right, like will others cooperate? You know, like one of the problems here is like the problem of free riding, the main problem, in fact, which is if I cooperate, if I do the right thing and don't overgraze, will others also cooperate? Because if others won't cooperate, why should I? Right? That's the basic reasoning, and I think it's the most common reasoning in a world dominated by capital, right? The world dominated by competition. You know, like the thing that binds capitalists together is that they're all in competition. So it makes sense that this logic, like once you're in that world, cooperation becomes like inexistent. It's not a viable path. So Ostrom says that traditionally with the tragedy of the commons, there's two solutions. You either have the theory of the firm, which it's not adequate at all, but the idea is, you know, if you want someone to take care of the pasture, they need to own it. So if you have a common pasture, if it's being overgrazed or it's in danger of that, you slice it up, give it to different owners. And you can trust that if they own that part of the land, then they won't overgraze it, because they need to continually use that portion that they own.
It's almost like, again, it's like putting it in, if you put it in the commodity form, now you sense the negative effects, right? Because they devalue your possession.
Yeah, you turn the externality of the cost into an internal cost. So it's something you can account for in your ownership. The problem here, of course, is like, not by virtue of certain parts of the commons, you can't really completely internalize the cost. Like,
yeah, what does it mean to internalize pollution?
Yeah, pollution. Ostrom uses this nice example of like water, fishing in water. Like, fish move around. So let's say I give you like this part of the lake. I mean, what does that really mean that you own? Does that mean you own the fish that come into that part of the lake only? But then if you, let's say, pollute that part, then it'll kill the fish for everyone, right? So by virtue of this, something about this resources cannot be sliced up completely, right? And the more we go into the ecosystem of the earth, right, the more we see this kind of interconnected nature of resources come into play. Yeah, the pandemic is a great example of that, right? Like, it can't really be kind of, you can't really draw a border around things like that. Okay, so that's one solution that fails, the theory of the firm. And the other one is the theory of the state, which is you have a monopoly of violence, and using that, you can force everyone to cooperate. So you set up a law, for example, you say like, no overgrazing, no one can have more than this much amount of cattle. The problem with this is that the state is usually very far away from the situation that needs to be governed, right? Not only is it doesn't really know what's going on the ground, but also it's very costly to monitor and update the rules of the commons. So the state is not an expert in every situation, like what's happening on the ground. And when it sends, let's say, monitors, there's all these kind of negative, what's it called, feedback effects, where, depending on like how you report to the state and how the state sees the situation, there's corruption and so on. Like, it really is not adequate to that situation. And in fact, it's kind of like Hayek's critique, right? Of Hayek's whole point is like, the market's nice because it's all about people translating local knowledge into price signals. So in that sense, yeah, the state isn't able to do that. The state doesn't have that powerful of an eye.
And I think there's also something to it which is important, that I remember in one of the texts that you sent us, I think the one on like giving a summary of Ostrom's work and like general research project, they make this really basic but important statement that that it's very hard to categorize the commons. So they're very singular. So for example, it's the sort of externality logic for a lake that has no connection with other bodies of water. It's totally different than, for example, for a river where it's connecting large chunks of space or air or information or this or that. So since you don't have a clear category for this bunch of things that present the same problem, it's hard to pass on laws for it, because they cannot really be general laws, because the way that things behave are very, very specific, right?
Yeah.
Actually, that part of the text also caught my attention and reminded me of what Lautman is saying about generalization versus generalities. The fact that you cannot generalize the problems that circumvent commons is very similar to the situation of science in that matter. That basically it is not through the generalization that we advance them, but or creation of generalization, but creation of generalities. And also, in the same passage, it was mentioning because of lack of generalization, it is not the fact that you can develop rules in order to govern or provide a governance structure. So the governance structure over the management of the commons are not based on a set of rules that apply to different commons for the same reason, because you cannot create a genre of these issues and then create rules that apply to each genre.
Yes.
What Ostrom is providing is design principles, which to me are very much like an axiomatic system, that a general way of looking at the most fundamental aspects that you want to derive rules or theorems according to the system that you inscribe in those design principles. So it was very refreshing for me to see that that basically it has complete alignment with what Lautman is saying.
Yeah, there's an interesting parallel, between exploring the commons and exploring kind of the logical framework of, or the logical structure of some kind of system, right? I agree. Like, basically, if you try to boil it down to some set of rules that apply to this type of thing, let's say a lake or a river, you miss out on the local conditions. And this is also why I think experimentation becomes important in everything we've been talking about. When we talk about what is a political experiment and how do organizations experiment, I think one really concrete way to think about it is like in these interactions with the commons, because there are properties of the commons that are just because they are part of the site. By definition, if they are the site, we don't know what's in there, right? We don't have the language or the predicates to even formulate rules about it.
So that you cannot derive a foundational logic that overlooks all the have to create a local situation and then study that local situation. It sounds like Ostrom is coming right out of the French epistemology school.
Yes.
But one thing that is important, though, I think, is that it's tempting to give a sort of categorical definition of the commons in this way, right? Like they are those things which are hard to, that cannot be grasped by available predicates or something like this. But it's not. I mean, we have a more positive rather than negative description of these commons that are at stake in her theory, right? Because it seems like this quality of I can assess the utility, I cannot assess the externalities. This is the effect of a positive structure, because natural resources, information, they are very widespread, right? They resist. I mean, and to go back to something we were talking about last time, right? They resist being treated as input-output structures. They seem undirected, right?
Yeah.
You can't really say what will change with a change in that system. So they look less like, let's say, material for a machine or machines themselves, and they in the sense of input, and then you have a transformation, and they're clear cut. You can tell what was and what happened to the material, right? And they seem to be like those things that don't have, let's say, clear ports to them, right? You can't really tell what goes in, what goes out, and to what it's connected, because it's just connected to many things, right? Just so we leave the sort of negative, more philosophical definition, like the commons are this site. I mean, there is a material reason why widespread systems that are, because of that, they're usually treated as environment rather than specific systems, right? That they are overly connected to the situation in undirected ways, right? So it's, for example, the air, I think is a great example. You can't really treat the air. It's not easy to see a situation. Like, for example, if you have a wind power plant, you can treat the air as an input and the wind, right? But in the case of pollution, for example, you don't get to treat the air as this sort of, it's the output of this thing, and then it goes as an input into that thing, because it's just so ubiquitously connected to objects in the situation. And in an undirected way, you can't really tell what sends information to what, right? Then you have the effect of it being hard to predicate, costly to treat as a private resource, hard to legislate over, right? So we can actually give perhaps a bit more positive description of why this is the case, right?
Yeah, but I think this also translates back into like our idea of the site. I mean, I understand like if we stick to the language of the site and this like kind of abstract framework, then we're losing the specific positive nature of resources. But I think it's something nice about when you say like everything's ubiquitously, it's so ubiquitously connected. That's almost like a weird interpretation of the self-belonging aspect of the site, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Like the site is a part of the world, but it's also kind of stands for the whole of the world in some way, right?
Yeah.
It's just like I feel like the air is a part of the world, but it's so connected to all the other systems that you can't really say like, you can't really draw a border between it and the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something like that, and I feel like it's a very nice interpretation of everything we're talking about with technology, right? And instead of talking about sets and situations and stuff, like we're talking about systems connecting with other systems, but we still have this like a frontier that we can draw from.
Yeah.
So Ostrom points out the failures of these two theories, the firm and the state, which I think also it's nice because it mirrors the title of Rodrigo Nunez's book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal. I think like the firm is kind of this horizontal kind of structure, decentralized firms operating through the market. The state is kind of this vertical hierarchical thing. I don't know, but I feel like Ostrom's looking for the same thing, right? Neither the vertical power of the state nor the horizontal power of the market. What is this third thing that can also deal with the tragedy of the commons? So here's just a kind of a general quote about the process of organizing. So at the most general level, the problem facing common pool resource appropriators is one of organizing. How to change the situation from one in which appropriators act independently to one in which they adopt coordinated strategies to obtain higher joint benefits or reduce their joint harm. That does not necessarily mean creating an organization. Organizing is a process, and organization is the result of that process. An organization of individuals who constitute an ongoing enterprise is only one form of organization that can result from the process of organizing. Okay, so this is kind of I think in line with this investigation that we're talking about, like if it's not the organization as such that we care about, it's this process that's kind of intertwined with the environment itself. I think that's very in line with what we've talked about. And even though we can use, like we talked about the operad and this nesting structure of systems within systems, kind of composing together, that's all valid. But I think the idea of the organizational process itself, it also has this nice kind of connotation with the site and with exploring the world point by point, right? The process explores the world through what's accessible in the resource. Okay, so the basic idea, so Ostrom also goes through many examples of different communities. I can jump ahead, that were able to manage their resources successfully. And I won't really go into each of them just for sake of time. I mean, if you go to Governing the Commons, like the whole book is about different institutions, and some of them lasting centuries, right? And she abstracts away from all of these to find these design principles, which we will talk about a little bit. So let's talk about the 3 problems she finds. These are kind of problems for game theory and economics, which is very individualist based, right? If you start from the individual and maximizing utility and all that stuff, these problems seem impossible to solve. So the first problem is new institutions. How do new institutions form in the presence of free riding? Again, free riding is the phenomena where if I do the work of contributing to the institution, or I pay the cost, how do I know that others won't just benefit without contributing, right? And if everyone knows that everyone else might do that, how do new institutions form, right? So it's a scalar problem. In our language, it's a scalar problem, right? Because from the scale of the individual, from the resolution of the individual, you cannot see beyond this point of what is an incentive for an organization to form. And the second problem is credible commitments. How do long-term commitments form in the presence of time discounting? So I might make an agreement with the group, but we know that at some point in the future, it's possible that the short-term benefit of breaking the rule is more, it's better to break it in the short term than to uphold the commitment, right? So time discounting is a phenomenon in game theory where future rewards count less than present rewards, right? So everyone is supposed to have this kind of discounting variable that kind of shows how much of a long-term thinker you are, right? If you evaluate things really long-term, then you have less of a time discount. But if you kind of, let's say you're hungry now, then your time discounting function is very sharp, right? You want food now, so whatever happens in the future, it doesn't matter, right? What's important is the short-term benefit. So you can think about any kind of commons where the commitments depend on there not being some kind of crisis, such that the short-term benefits would outweigh the long-term ones. And again, yeah, it seems like every institution would have this problem. And then the third problem is mutual monitoring. So why would someone agree to monitoring someone else? Why would we all agree to monitor each other if the cost of punishing someone else is high to the punisher? So there's this kind of the root of, let's say, like cartel behavior or corruption, where I could punish you for doing something wrong, or I could just join you in, you and I can both take advantage of the system, and leave everyone else out, right? It's kind of I think it's kind of a sub problem of the free riding issue, but monitoring requires that there's actual accountability to identify people who are individuals who are breaking the rules, right? So again, all these three problems are very based on the individual scale of organization. So for us, it seems like, okay, we know that there are organizations that have overcome this issue. And Ostrom also identifies this. She says, like, okay, it seems like these three problems are impossible from the standpoint of traditional economics, but that says more about traditional economics than politics as such, right? It says something about the failure of the economic framework to understand something about organizations. Does this part make sense? This three problems?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand if there is a common kind of, it always concerns, it seems like it always concerns the point where you would have to affect something on others, but having, for example, the free rider thing, right? I'm just trying to understand what they rely on. Like, if I do my share of work, again, because rewards and costs don't concern me alone, but they're kind of asymmetric due to the collective. It means that if I do the work, there is kind of like, there will be some other person in the group that can get rewards without doing this correspondent work, right?
Yeah.
So the rewards grow in a proportion different to the cost of not working, right? Again, so that division that Hardin mentions between rewards and costs, again, seems relevant, right? But with the third point which you mentioned, that seems also important, and it's clearer in the second point, which is there's some unknown variable that, right? It's not that the cost will not return to you, because, well, if there is free riding, there will come a point where the organization will not work, right? But you can't advance to that picture. Like, you don't have access to that. Like, that's just a speculation, right? Whereas the reward is not. So the rewards you can sense the rewards, but you cannot sense this other kind of curve of how costly it becomes to be a free rider, right? And it seems like that's a similar thing with the credible commitment, because there's something about this long-term gain of, for example, refraining to pollute, which, again, it's asymmetric with the immediate reward, and you don't have direct access to it somehow. Like, you don't sense it, right?
Yeah.
And the mutual monitoring is the one that seems slightly different, because, I mean, you mentioned the example of, why would I punish somebody if I can just join them in doing something wrong? But I think you can also think of it from the other side, which is, for me to monitor someone else, it means that I need to do an action, which is to monitor, to be vigilant, or to punish, which has no immediate reward to me, right? It just keeps things on track.
Yeah.
So again, you could think of it in the sense that it again concerns a cost and a reward, which are not symmetric, and that I don't really get to sense the cost, right? For example, the
Mhm.
cost of not monitoring is not that obvious, right?
Exactly. And this, yeah, it seems like a resolution problem, right? Because all three of these problems, there is like a real cost and a real reward to doing these things. But they're at the individual level, you can't sense them, right? But it reminds me a lot about when we were doing the thing on our study of Cartani, we came up with those diagrams for the four modes of exchange, right? And we said like each of the modes of exchange are kind of like a type of surrogate reasoning where you can measure the benefit to yourself via going through the circuit of that mode. So like I don't know, like in the sense of the gift, logic of the gift, you kind of can sense reward from how much the other owes you. So like the gift stands as like the surrogate, right? Then you have the state. The state is a surrogate for you to see more like beyond your community. So you can say like, you know, I'm giving my taxes away to, or whatever, taxes, right? You're giving taxes to the state so that you get this benefit of being part of this larger empire or whatever. And with the mode of exchange C, you have commodities, which also are they kind of enhance your resolution in some way. I mean, you can see through the price system, right? Because like the whole paradox Marx points out is like capitalists are actually the biggest misers of all. So you can ask, why does the capitalist deprive themselves of all rewards on earth so that they can make more money? But it's kind of a similar thing, right? Like the structure is that because through the commodity, they're able to see a reward that isn't at the level of an individual necessarily. And then finally, in the fourth mode of exchange, we said like there's something about Cartani uses like religion as an example of being able to do something for someone else. And that very act of doing something for someone else is the reward. Something like that, right? So I feel like all four of those map kind of into this, like they all treat these problems in some way.
And I think that actually perhaps we should have added, because you added something about, let's say, the firm structure, something about the state structure. And I mean, it seems to me that, I mean, Harding's argument was not, I mean, so blind to the fact that, yeah, under certain conditions, you know, managing the commons might be feasible, but he associates it with very small communities, right? And I mean, we could add also the constraints or the limits of community managing of the commons, because it seems like it's feasible under very specific conditions. Like what, I mean, I can see the communal management of a lake, but what does it mean to talk about the community type management of, you know, the ozone layer? Like, to which community? I mean, you know, like it can also break on that side as well. So we can actually not only have the neither market-based nor state-based, but I think in some way there is a class, at least some share of problems of the commons that are also kind of, you know, exploit this distinction between the immediate reward functions and the hard to measure cost functions. Explore this due to the scale, right? Which might also make it like hard to find, okay, but what sort of communitarian sense can facilitate the credible commitment, the monitoring of free riders and punishment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps we could also add the community form as also something which, as the mode A would also have its problems, right?
Yeah. Mode A would have the problems of scale for sure. And that's, I would say that's the also limitation of Ostrom's work, at least in the ones I've read so far, is that you do hit a scaling problem. Yeah, like these three examples, they're still, although they're pretty big, like, they've successfully managed certain commons for centuries, like fishermen in Turkey. They were able to, come up with a very intricate system for allocating parts of the water to different fishermen. So what you basically do is, like, at the beginning of the fishing season, you kind of sign up, and you, based on lottery, you're assigned a portion of the water. But they know that the fish, as the year goes on, the fish swim in a certain direction. So, like, I guess they move kind of, let's say, westward. So if you got a bad spot initially, like you signed up and you were assigned a bad part of the water, doesn't have a lot of fish, over time, your spot would move in the counter direction that the fish move, so that it would maximize the chance that everyone would get like a good fish at some point, a good area at some point. Yeah, so things like that, like but it's very specific to, unless you know about the movement of the fish, you would not be able to come up with this this system. Right. So yeah, I don't know, but it's a small scale example. Yeah. So I left some stuff at the end about, like, going from local to global. There is some research on that. We can get to that. Actually, this slide is important because Ostrom identifies the compositional character of rules. So she says that we can think of rules as nested like computer languages, having the same structure as computer languages. This quote here: "This nesting of rules within rules at several levels is similar to the nesting of computer languages at several levels. And what can be done at a higher level will depend on the capabilities and limits of the software at that level, on the software at the deeper level, and on the hardware, which is the resource itself." So yeah, I mean, the metaphor here is, like, you have nature, which is kind of hardware, it's the fixed thing, but then you build rules on top of that, which allow you to kind of extract different levels of rewards for the organization. And I think it's more complicated than that, because this assumes, like, the software cannot change the hardware, when in fact, like, there are ways that, the rules themselves can kind of change. Like, you could have everyone kind of contributing, like, working the land in such a way that it actually makes the land more enriched over time, or makes the sea have more biodiversity, for example. So it's not like the hardware is fixed and the software is, like, changeable. It's more malleable than that. But this diagram on the left is from that text that you guys sent me, that Jules Hedges and those open games guys are working on, which I think matches this idea very closely, right? That you can nest games within games. And every game has its own characteristics, but when you nest them together, you get, like, some emergent system. And using this, you can kind of model cooperation more effectively. So one of the problems earlier that I mentioned about thinking of common, so let's go back here, the these three problems of collective action, they actually go away a bit if you think about it not simply as a single game, or it's called a one-shot game in game theory, but you think of it as a iterated game, a game that keeps happening. And the outcome of the first game is fed into the inputs of the next game and so on, right? If you think of it as a game that keeps occurring, you can actually model certain, let's say, like learning phenomena, right? Like if you think of the prisoner dilemma, right? Yes, and if you give them one chance, they'll probably not cooperate, the two prisoners. But if they are continually put into the situation, they might realize, right, by seeing the actions of the other, they might realize that it's more profitable to cooperate. So this, I think, is where the composition becomes interesting. I mean, they've come up with a whole framework using lenses, optics, and so on to allow like sequential games. Yeah, not everything here is sequential, because in some cases it's like 3 different farmers, each connecting up. But in the paper, they also talk about the same 3 farmers can play the game over and over again and devise new strategies based on that. Yeah. So
this that you just said on the paper you sent, they also talk a lot about trust, and it seems that in order to solve like this coordination problem of the commons, you need to kind of like be able to create this sort of channels of trust in which you can kind of like agree upon, right? And
yes,
one way to do that is by having memory. So being, as you said, like exposed to the same game many times, and so you're able to form like some sort of like common memory. And I was thinking of like the way that labor is organized today, and like the challenges of like building solidarity is a lot, I think, related to the difficulty to build this sort of like common trust in, because like work changes so fast, like people change the job a lot, they're not able to find this, to kind of like create those channels of cooperation, because they're basically changing all the time. So it's
yes, I think here is somehow like where the surrogate reasoning is important, and where organizational thinking becomes important, right? It's the memory of the organization itself has to be more durable than the individuals. So something about the organization needs to keep, and I think traditionally in these examples of these communities, it's the memory is in the rules themselves. Like it's somehow, embedded in the tradition, in the communal, let's say, communal rules, but not necessarily in a way that like it's kind of opaque. Like you can't necessarily look at the rules and understand at first glance why they are that way, and unless you examine the resource itself. And Ostrom does, a lot of Ostrom's work is like pointing in that direction of this kind of evolutionary perspective, rather than thinking of it as you can solve this in one go. You need some kind of pressures to get to the solution. But on the topic of trust, I did have this slide, but I didn't include it in the main slides here. But in that one of the texts that I sent, they did talk about that there's 2 types of trust. There's trust in action. So like free riding would be an example. Like if I put in the work, will others also put in the work? So I have to trust that you will put in the work. But then there's also trust in information. So this is everything, like just think about like fake news or misinformation. How do you how do you make sure that everyone agrees upon what's actually happening, right? And this is another scaling issue, because when there's a problem, can you be sure that everyone agrees on what that problem actually is? And then they suggest in that paper network analysis as the way of tackling this problem. So obviously, like your immediate neighbors, you have more, you're more likely to trust, right? Right. At least that's the standard prejudice that we have. Like you will trust those in your immediate community more than you will trust those from far away. So if you build a network, if you draw like a graph of everyone, you can kind of view where the trust is coming from.
It's interesting because it's also treating trust in terms of networks. It clarifies that trust is actually correlated with distance. So it's also kind of spatial, and you can also think of it in terms of that asymmetry between reward and costs, right? You need trust to turn cost into a less distant measure, right?
Yes. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Like trust, not in a psychological sense necessarily, but trust in the sense of, like phenomenological. Trust is what makes the system itself, the entire system, or the rewards of the system.
And it's interesting also because you guys mentioned memory, and I remember now that first chapter from Bogdanov that we read together, where he was talking about the transfer of methods, the transfer of organizational methods, and he calls tradition a form of transfer of organizational methods, right? Sort of database of forms of doing things that work, right? And like popular sayings and things like this. And I think that this is a classical issue, right? I mean, it's very different to trust that something happened to person A and the effect was B, than to have like to have that information kind of decoupled from the specific situation, and for it to become something like a general statement of the form, if somebody does A, B happens, right? It doesn't need to happen to you, right? You don't need to play the game many times. Like for it to become something like a tradition, it's precisely the situation where it happening to others is enough so that it doesn't need to happen to you.
Exactly.
Like, you don't need to play the game. Like if you have 3 farmers, you don't need each of them to go through something. If one of them goes through something and there is trust, in this sort of sense of making present some sort of, the correlation between the effects and what was done, you actually don't need to go through it. Probably it can count as an iteration, even though it's just the first time with different actors, right?
Dennis.
Yeah.
Can you go back to that slide with 3 problems? So the problem number 1 is new institution. The other one is credible commitment and manual monitoring. So the
mutual monitoring.
Sorry, mutual. Is trust applicable equally to all 3 problems?
Yeah, probably mostly 1 and 2, but I guess the third one as well, but maybe to a different level.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you assume that if you take it in the sense I propose, that the cost of monitoring, right? It's like it's a classic problem. Like you're doing your part, and that is already, let's say, takes up some time. But monitoring that others are doing their part is an extra sacrifice of time you need to give, but you don't get anything in return, right? It just confirms that you will get in return what you already was gonna get by doing your share. So it has no clear reward, right? It's just, let's say, a way of, I think it fits in that same problem kind of idea, right? That
yeah,
you don't
it's
get
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's interesting because the third one, all of them, but especially the third one, I think the cost of monitoring drops inversely to the trust, right? Increasing because if I can trust that very few people will break the rule, I don't need as many monitors. Like in the examples, yeah, and some of these examples here, like one person in the community is given the task of monitoring everyone else, but with the knowledge, with the implicit knowledge that like if everyone wanted to break the rule, this one person could not really catch everyone, right? This is almost like this person is just kind of performing a kind of a symbolic function there. Like they're there just to say like, okay, don't break the rules, but they're not really checking everyone.
It's like those guys checking train tickets in Europe.
Exactly, yeah. It's performative. Like you could evade them if you wanted to, but yeah, there's enough trust that not enough people will try to do that to break the system.
Can you also explain what you meant by phenomenological trust as opposed to ethical or psychological trust?
Yes, I think phenomenological trust simply means like, are the rewards and costs apparent to everyone? And how do you make them apparent? Right?
Yeah, I think a
Yeah.
good way of putting it is that, let's say, if you think of it as a sort of, if it's almost like if it's ethical, means that you're behaving as if, right? You should trust. So it's not coming from anything observable or nothing you can sense. So you need to kind of supplement. I can't really know, but I'll behave as if, because that's the best way to behave, right? Which is different from, for example, if you tell me like don't speed up or against the wind, it's not like a prohibition coming from ethics, it's just that I can actually see what the effect as well. I don't need to, let's say, theorize it as a belief, right?
So it's a structural problem. You build trust into the way that the system provides checks and balances for itself.
Yeah, I think, you can say that it's the system. It's almost more than the system, like in this terms of, in the sense of rules. Again, because you can break the rules and nothing might happen to you, right? Because we're imagine we are not inside the theory of the state or the theory of the firm, right? How do we know that there's a cost in the firm? Well, you lose money, right? You lose money, people get fired. You can feel that if you're inside the firm. It is apparent. You don't need to trust in the sense of like, I trust my boss to do the right thing. I trust my coworkers. No, it's like the money will kind of enforce that trust. And the same thing with the state. You don't necessarily need to trust so much because you have this threat of violence that is there to enforce that trust. You will feel it if you break the law. So the mechanism in the case of what we're calling like PD, right? This fourth mode of exchange. What is the mechanism that makes trust appear in a non-individual way, right? Yeah, I mean, maybe it is a type of ethics. Like it makes me think about the Agamben's book, The Highest Poverty, right? The idea that rule following at some point becomes a form of life rather than something you could violate or not violate. But
Yeah, I
it's,
think it also goes back to the thing we were talking about last time, where something that was treated as an organization can be treated as an environment.
Mhm.
I think on the side, on the normative side, it has something to do with this transformation of, ethical behavior into something which is actually economic behavior, in the sense of it's less costly to assume this belief. It's different from, I must assume this belief. Those are two different ways of thinking about it, right? You can, I think that's kind of for the trust thing. That's kind of how you get a sort of correlate, because there's trust between actors, right? In the sense of I trust you, I am doing this, and I'm expecting you to do that. It seems to be more personal, more, let's say, local. Whereas this sort of the trust, the other form of trust that you mentioned now with the state and the firm, with money and with laws, I think they all have something to do with, let's say, benefiting from what's the least costly path within a space, right? They seem more formal or structural than the sort of ethical behavior, like an injunction, right? It's not an ought in that sense. Something else. I mean, it's something. Sorry.
I was gonna say, it's not an ought, but it also can kind of. I feel like it can set the ground for an ought, because, like, for example, in the state, yes, there is the threat of violence, but most of the time we don't obey the laws because we're afraid of the violence per se, but because it's kind of become the norm, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain like, you can think of all the things of like I don't know, sense of responsibility, or maybe to use Althusser's term, like interpolation, even like you're interpolated to kind of follow the laws without necessarily doing it under coercion. Like, of course, coercion is there, it's in the background, but the same thing for the firm. Like, I think I think there's some amount of like momentum or inertia there, where you just start doing it because that's the norm for in the field of competition. But I don't know if that's an important point.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm always a bit skeptic of people who overemphasize habits as if it was like a really existing force or domain, because it seems to me like we can pretty much boil down, the path of least resistance, which functions as a sort of substitute for conscious ethical behavior, to the path of least resistance of either what, the cases where reciprocity is more important than following the law, or profitability or employment, the cases where employability is more important than the law and reciprocity, and vice versa. Like when you say, I just act this way, not because I'm afraid of coercion, or I'm willing to kind of do something illegal or break the law, but it's at the same time something that is expected of me. Can't you just describe those habitual behaviors actually just by kind of talk like in a more situated way, by talking about, okay, there are situations where following the law is not the path of least resistance, right? It is, let's say, just being one with the guys, and that's actually, you're going to do some illegal behavior because of that, or the combination of forming a group and keeping your job, right? It's more important than following the law. Like, if you flatten out all those logics, there is no logic, and then you need to call it habits, because you don't know, there is no intelligible constraint. But with this sort of multiple constraint theories we have now, I think we can actually take that theory of people just get habituated to do it, and that's how normative behavior gets incorporated. We can just remove that hypothesis, like I'm not sure. I'm just trying to keep focus a bit more on what you said before, that it seems like there are these surrogate modes, right, with each mode of exchange, right? And they have their own forms of trust. And I have the impression that that's actually a pretty expressive theory. Like it's able to go very far. I'm not sure you need to assume that, well, people then start trusting each other because they're just in the habit of doing so.
I
I
agree.
point, like,
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, because it's not really a logic. Like you can't. It doesn't really fit as a logic to say it's a habit because it kind of applies to anything. Like anything can become habit. Yeah, but the actual constraints have to be there to even talk about the habit.
Yeah, and I think that there is a problem because for example, with the challenge you're dealing with, like for instance with Ostrom, right? You want to be able to find mechanisms through which the logical structure of reward and cost for dispersed resources, right? These common resources can be kind of accounted for, and I can turn it into the path of least resistance, right? It's more rational to cooperate, to sacrifice by monitoring, to do my share even though I could free ride. Like under which conditions that becomes the path of least resistance, right? That becomes, let's say, a shared environment and not a principled action out of ethical commitments to nature, for example, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's where it's the real work of when I say like treating the points, or when we're talking about treating a point, I feel like treating a point means making certain behaviors the path of least resistance, like right? If you think, yeah, because I was always kind of mystified by this idea of treating the points, like what it does seem to have this notion of duration. Like it's not something that just happens. Like you decided either this way or this way, and now you're done, right? Treating a point seems to have like this continuous interpretation to it, or semantics to it. And I think it fits very well. Like instead of a single game, you have a kind of a repeated game, or like what you're saying, making something the path of least resistance. It does take some like crafting of the environment. So I think that's really where we should go with this, is like, how do we build games that, to use the language of the game theory, like build games that incentivize the behavior that is appropriate to the given commons, or that is part of the decision, right? If you decide like these are the commons, we need to share this resource, treating that means building the correct organizational structures so that the reward and the cost become transparent to everyone, or somehow get mapped into rules that incentivize the right behavior. So this, just to finish up, I think we're only an hour and a half. So one thing that Ostrom points out that's interesting here is if you think about the rights over the commons, you can kind of divide them up, and you can see that the one that corresponds to capitalism or property rights is only the very last one here. So in let's say TC moments, you can still define the first four quite easily. So the right to enter the property, or obtain the resource or whatever, or like get to the resource, the right to withdraw something from it, so take something out of the resource for yourself, the right to manage it, so to change it somehow, like make improvements, or build fences or something like that. The right to exclude, I guess building fences would actually fall under this fourth one, to exclude others from it. And then finally, the right to sell or lease any of the above rights. I thought this was really interesting because normally we think of your ownership of the property as coinciding with these first four. But Ostrom points out that you can actually, communities have these first four as defined. They collectively define this often. You know, many communities will have their own court system, their own decision-making body to delineate the first four without needing concept of alienation of rights. Right? Alienation of rights is synonymous with like the commodity form, but it's not necessary. So, I mean, these four sets of rights, these are the kind of, I would say, like sub points of a commons, right? Once you decide that this is a commons, you need to decide also how to allocate these rights. And again, yeah, this has to do with our previous point of the path of least resistance as well, because if you give individuals the right, for example, to manage something, or it's a rule that everyone has to, let's say, clean up a resource if it is damaged or polluted or something like that, then you create incentive to not damage it, right? Like that's a simple way of turning an externality, external cost into an internal cost, right? If everyone has to manage that common resource. Okay, so anyway, this list here is Ostrom's design principles. So like Reza was saying, they're not general rules that you can apply to any resource, but they are like patterns, let's say, that kind of shape a successful behavior around these resources. So, okay, I don't need to read everything on the right here, but you need clearly defined boundaries, or you should strive to make them clear. Proportional equivalence between benefits and costs. So this is really important, right? Everything we were saying earlier about the benefits are immediate, the costs are kind of hidden. So something needs to produce an equivalence or proportionality between these two things. That's apparent to everyone. Collective choice arrangements. So those who are affected by the rules should also be the ones to modify the rules. This is also what you don't find in the theory of the firm, nor in the theory of the state, right? Usually the ones making the rules are not the ones affected by the rules. So this one's really important. That those need to be the same group. Monitoring, yeah, we have the problem of mutual monitoring here, so you need to find a way to solve that. Graduated sanctions, so those who violate the rules need to be punished, but the punishment needs to fit the crime, right? Conflict resolution mechanisms, so courts, someone needs to decide how to resolve conflicts, right? Or so a group needs to be able to decide. minimal recognition of the rights to organize. So this is the relationship between the organization and the larger world. So like, for example, if you're within a state, the state needs to allow the group to organize. Or if you're trying to start some form of organization within a firm, you need some recognition from the firm that you can do that, right? And then finally, this one is for larger organizations, but you need to be able to compose your institutions. So this is the thing about the like nesting the rules within rules, multiple layers of nested enterprises.
So basically that last one is the one that she devises for scaling, right?
Yeah.
Because the way that it seems to me like to translate, I mean, just before anything else, I mean, I think that her design principles are a good answer or as a sort of example or model to the question that sometimes we ask ourselves, like, okay, what sort of, you know, product can we offer to the sort of political situation, right? With the things we've been discussing. And I mean, I think she gives a really good example of somebody who went into, you know, looked at a bunch of organizational cases, develops a general theory, and then doesn't come up with a prescriptive or normative strategy at the other end, but with like, these are the things you should be aware of, right? They're like existential statements. Like these things exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
The boundary problem, the benefit cost problem, like.
Yeah, I like that formulation, because yeah, you can think of all these as different problems that every commons must you know, you must solve these problems basically.
Yeah. So I mean, it seems like to go back to Rez's suggestion, like if you want to create generalities rather than generalize out of the commons, you need to treat them as a sort of the existential statements are not of the form we all share this, we are all one, right? The positive statements about the commons are not generalizations out of situations. Like we are all on the planet Earth. It seems like what she identified in all these case studies is that people who actually manage the commons, the existential statements that they actually make are that certain X problem exists, right?
Yeah.
Or that problem exists, this problem exists. Like this is actually what show like how the commons become principle of action, not by claiming we're all one, right? It's not a positive statement about the common as a solution, right?
Yes. Yeah, I kind of see it as like, yeah, condensing previous investigations into the commons, into these set of basic problems that.
But at the same time, I think the other thing that kind of seems to me like if we try to translate these design principles into our terms, right, is that they are all kind of, she focuses on the sort of framework that it's kind of like you put communities in charge of state structures, right, in the sense of managing resources, logistics, and so on. So it's like communitarian structures dominating over states, and then you kind of create this upper boundary problem of, okay, but how can this scale up? Because if you need to know where fishes go, if you need to have like commitment, like people committees, right? Popular committees to assess conflicts, and if you need to kind of bridge the gap between benefits and costs, all of this seems like the community form is helping to provide a solution by keeping this property and commodity logics kind of held in check. But then she recreates a problem of, okay, but how can this be scaled up? And then you have this nesting issue, right? It's a kind of it's similar to Karatani as well, this idea that, well, mode D is actually mode A minus some restriction, right? And
Yeah.
I think that you could probably interpret Karatani in this idea that what allows mode D to be a global scale mode A is that you drop the clause of retribution. If gifts don't need to be retributed, you can actually scale up because it's the counter gift that actually makes you have to stay inside a community, right? So it's kind of a similar feel to it, that communitarian logic can keep the normative logic of the state at bay, can keep commodification away, like the alienation structure of the selling of rights and so on, but the right to sell and so on. But then I'm not sure if she goes further in this direction, but then you have the problem of how do you scale up this communitarian structure, right? And I think Karatani's idea is that, well, you scale up by dropping part of the logic of mode A, right? You have this kind of gift structure, but you don't have a counter gift.
Yeah. I wonder if how generalizable that is, like.
Yeah. Because I mean, in a certain sense, doesn't it look like she's trying to create this sort of prosthesis for the counter gift? Because the counter gift guarantees that, whatever you're giving, you're going to get back. So it guarantees the reward cost proportionality, right? In some level. And well, if you want to scale up a communitarian structure, you're going to lose track of the rewards and the cost connection. Who guarantees that the things I'm giving, I'm going to get back if I'm not bound by, personal relations?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that, monitoring, conflict solving, she's trying to patch up something which kind of still does the function of, the counter gift, like what you get, the guarantee that you get back, right? Trust, rewriting of rules, monitoring, all of those things are kind of structures that keep the signal of we're okay, keep on giving, and you'll still keep on receiving, right?
Yes. Yeah, I like that idea. That it is a prosthesis in a way for the immediate. It's like you start out with this very transparent reward and costs, but although it's very immediate, it doesn't have the power to scale.
Mm-hmm.
And then you need to create a artificial eye, basically some phenomenological object that can maintain the equivalence between costs and benefits at larger scales. So you have to see with that beyond the individual, right? Through using the organization to see the benefits and costs. Yeah, so you can think of these design principles as how to design the proper eye for the proper prosthesis for this this movement, right? To see the benefit, the reward structure.
Yeah, that's interesting.
No. This one is just some empirical analysis of two different forests, I think in Nepal. Yeah. That one of them followed Ostrom's design principles, the other one not so much, and then kind of showed like one of these, the density of trees over time increased. Yeah, but yeah, I'm not sure how valuable this is, but it's just to show that there's some empirical evidence to show the effectiveness of.
Actually, it's also a bit of a reality check. That I mean, it's really cool to talk about. Yeah, she doesn't account for scaling, but look at the size of the territory. Like it's huge. It's not like oh my god, it's so local. But yeah, it's local with like I don't know, a couple of square kilometers. It's,
Exactly. Yeah, no, it's real. Yeah, this is actually what people use to manage
Knowing what
these
part of the
things.
world it is, probably 200 million people.
Yeah, huge. Yeah, scale. And done outside of the state and capital, like what we called an NSC or whatever, like nation state capital structure. It's pretty amazing. So yeah, here. This is just a restatement. Actually, exactly what we were saying before. It's the same design principles, but now formed as questions rather than the solution statements. Yeah, so like, how can we better define boundaries? How can we improve the relationship between benefits and costs? Yeah, so it's exactly what we're saying, that these are problems that every local organization, I mean, at the local level, you have to investigate, right? And I also think everything we were talking about with experiments follows here. An organization is an experiment in something like these questions, right? It's trying to answer one of these questions.
You know, I was thinking about this, and now that you presented this, it kind of convinces me it might be a good approach, because, you know, I had a hard time when reading Jules Tack's on open games and so on, and all the literature been kind of tracking on these optics and stuff. And last time we were talking about at the end about, you know, the difference between controllers, because we're interested in these three kind of basic functions, or whatever you want to call them. Like this idea of a sensor that can, for example, sense an observation or some information is coming from the outside, or some the reward we got from some strategy and so on. This idea of something like the equivalent of a knob, right, or an action, an intervention, and the idea of a player or an agent of some sort, right? And it seems like we have these three categories in our idea of experimentation, for example, with agents having to do with certain hypotheses, certain general parameters, interventions, and then what you get to observe. But this also applies to very strict control systems with knobs, sensors, and some sort of parameter for these knobs, to learners and to games, right? With strategies, rewards, and players. And we were asking, okay, but can we really model political processes as games? And I think that with the common things here, when you mentioned the fish, it kind of hit me that there's perhaps a difference here, is that you're not playing a game with other players. You're playing a game with the resource. Like the resource is the adversary in a way, right?
Yeah.
Kind of. It's not really, I mean, the shift seems to be in that sense, like, which is also what experiments kind of are about. Like experiments are not just, I'll do this and I want to see how the world behaves, like your move, you know, which is more like Foucault's theory of experiments. Like people are just torturing nature. It's like a game you play with nature. I think it misses it misses an important idea, which is to make nature into your partner is not to play a game, right? Nature doesn't play game. I mean, it's not the meaning of Einstein's statement, but you can take it in that way. Like God doesn't play dice means like God is not in a casino or something. It's not about quantum mechanics. In that sense, perhaps that's a way of moving from games to experiments, right? Games, you have players and strategies amongst players, and when you try to account for the balance of a game, you will say like the player won, another player lost. That doesn't make sense with experiments, as we were talking about. Even failed experiments might be good experiments, right? The connection is slightly different. Like, can you turn a resource into something else, right? Into like a connective principle. for example, for scientific statements. So when you were talking about the fish and the fact like you don't control the fish, you're not going to change the fish's behavior, but you can kind of negotiate with the fish's behavior. Can you say that you won over the fish? No, right? That would be the case if, let's say, you caught all the fish and you killed them all, perhaps, right? But when you are negotiating with it, it's something slightly different. And I think that that actually goes very nicely with a kind of very Bogdanovian principle, because even though it sounds very, anthropocentric, I don't think it really is. But Bogdanov has this kind of idea that class struggle is a defense against the struggle with nature, right? People fight amongst each other to circumvent the problem of actually fighting with nature, which is totally different thing. It's not a game, right? It becomes something else. It's qualitatively different. It's not like a dominion over nature in the way you dominate other people, but it seems to have this similar idea that, well, these processes of dealing with the commons, it puts people in a slightly different position other than players having strategies to, let's say, get a reward, which is a share of a resource, right? The resource itself participates in a slightly different way. Like you're negotiating with its own rules. The moment you're negotiating with the resources rules and not really putting it under your own fully, you can't really say, right, it is just something to be shared, partitioned, delineated. It's like it's on the table as a partner, right?
Yeah.
I might be going to, this poetic, this way, but you see, kind of, there is something in the middle of that craziness that might help to make the difference between why is this perhaps not really a game, like, because that was my question to you, like, in which sense are these things games? Like, they're only games if you shift the focus from the reproduction of the resource, like the shared reproduction of people and resources, and turn them into the game of trust between players regarding the resource, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me like the moment you do that, the moment it becomes a game between people who use the resource to decide on their strategies regarding the resource, you already moved slightly away from the issue, which is the ultimate goal is the reproduction of people and the resource, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, because like part of the game, because of what we earlier called the ubiquitous connection of these commons, you can't really beat nature, because to beat nature is to like lose yourself, right? Like you need to basically make nature win as well in some sense, right? I mean, just the idea of competition with nature doesn't exactly make sense to some extent. I don't know. But yeah, the thing you were saying earlier also gave me an insight, which is like, if the prisoners in the prisoner dilemma saw it less about winning against each other, but more about playing against the police, then they would solve the game, right?
It's a logical time thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, instead of saying how like why is it that your strategy is formed in relation to the strategies of the other prisoner and not the strategy of the police themselves, or the environment, right, which is the prison.
So, can you repeat this, Dennis?
Just saying that, why in the prisoner's dilemma are the prisoners formulating their strategy with regards to each other and not the police or the legal system, whatever that's put them in that situation? Because the whole reason the Nash equilibrium deviates from the optimal solution in the prisoner's dilemma is because your strategy is compared to the strategy of the other prisoners, and you have all the problems of like trust, right? Like, how can I if I cooperate, how do I trust that the other guy is going to cooperate? So it's you versus the other prisoner. That leads to this deviation, and tragedy of the commons is the same way, right? It's one farmer against all the other farmers. But if you shift that from being one farmer against the other farmers, and it becomes something oriented around the commons, the land itself, or whatever the resource, then that shifts the meaning of the game, right?
Yeah, and I think that it connects with something we were talking about last time, which is what makes things political, in fact, which is, and I think it connects to the idea of points in Badiou, right? He doesn't want to talk about decisions in the sense of making moves in a world, right? The idea is that the moves you make help to make something consistent that wasn't consistent before, which is what Renzo was talking about. Like, things might start as gestures in political movements, like small gestures, like mimified actions or spontaneous things, but with time they become a resource, right? So the thing that looked like a strategy in a game actually becomes indistinguishable from a resource. Like, it's not just something there's a gray area there, right? And I mean, this is very clear for Badiou as a sort of strong theory of politics, that these decisions, because they concern something that had no clear existence, the more the decisions are consistent amongst each other, the more something that didn't exist gets consistent as well, right? And I think that this is a bit, perhaps that shift is a bit like the shift we're talking about, the shift between playing games where the stakes are kind of set, or the rules are, even if they're open and not very clear, they're still, let's say, what counts as an agent is quite well defined, right? And this other version, which I think has something to do with experimentation, because you're betting that whatever comes as a kind of effect of your interventions might make an object consistent that wasn't consistent before, right? That's why failed experiments can be useful, and why an experiment that I do is already, let's say, the memory for someone else's experiment. They don't need to, if a result is confirmed, it's confirmed for everyone, right? So your decision becomes a consistent resource.
Yeah, this is a great point. That, yeah, maybe that's one of the features of a political resource, even, like the series of experiments needs to be somehow available as a resource.
Yeah, exactly. Because, for example, take your red version of the prisoner's dilemma, right? If they cooperate against the police, that cooperation becomes something that didn't exist, right?
Yes.
So it's something that is available now. You can. It's not just, let's say, how do we share or partition amongst each other the weights of these strategies, or the cost and the benefits of taking this or that position. Actually, by taking certain strategies together, for example, or doing something slightly different in this kind of mock version of the game, I'm not sure you could treat it as a game anymore, right?
I mean, you can still think of it as it's just a game that's nested or repeated. I mean, yeah, I don't know. There's definitely limits to the game theory, like as far as what it describes, but they also observe this phenomena where if you run a game, if you keep running a game, you get a learning behavior. It's possible to get a learning behavior, not because of like some like agency or anything like that, but just the system, the games themselves will change in their structure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that this thing we're talking about affects in any way, like, it's called open games theory because that's where they started, but we already saw that the basic formalism applied to things that are not games, right? They're just they just are used to calling games the most general theory of strategies and rewards, right? But it's not necessarily the largest, like the most general name for it. So I don't think that changes in itself what we're saying. I'm just trying to understand, like, from Ostrom's examples, like I'm wondering, like, why is she's criticizing this sort of rational, maximalizing utility sort of thinking, which is the thing that justifies, in a way, treating things as games. So she's, let's say, putting into question something. She's bringing up, I mean, of course, there are cooperative games as well, but yeah, I'm not clear on this yet. Perhaps cooperative games are already enough to account for the change, right, from competitive to cooperative. But I'm just trying to understand, due to certain similarities, if this characteristic of what Badiou is describing, that something that didn't have consistency gained consistency through these decisions, if that gaining of consistency isn't something that qualifies this new object as a resource itself, right? For example, knowing that you can count on people that you didn't know you could count before, that's a resource, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a strategy that you take. I decided to trust you, and this was the outcome. It was a good outcome. That's something. But I know that there is something like a shared trust, and I can use this in different ways. It's not exactly the same thing. It's not a strategy, right? It's more like an existential statement. There is this thing, right?
Yeah, there is this thing, but I think there is a kind of yeah, I don't know, like resources do have some kind of existence in the game theory framework. They I think they fit kind of in this undirected resource sharing thing. Like it's just a game that's you can rely on, where the equilibrium is already kind of set. I feel like I don't know. What I'm trying to imagine is something like this thing at the end here. So the climate system, the food system, and the socioeconomic system. Those are the three, and then other ecosystems here, right on the left. This is from the International Panel on Climate Change, one of their reports.
The previous one, then, not the less depressing one.
Yeah, not the slightly less depressing, but it's still, yeah, it's showing the interconnection between, and it's basically lenses here, right? Like you see every box here has like a impacts and emissions, like the forward and the backwards ports. And so it's very much like it wouldn't take much to turn this into like open games, I think. But I think here, like if we think about, you know, it doesn't really make sense to call these games because we're all kind of needing these things. Like they're more just like systems. But I think that even though the semantics is different, you still have the two ports, right? The port going in and the port going out.
And now that you show this, I mean, you know, we were talking about this kind of morphogenetic problem, right? Of moving from common undirected resources to how does this become ports? And now it's clear to me that looking at this, right, that it's like splitting an undirected connector into two arrows, right?
Yeah.
To find this sort of connective, communicative structure is almost like you're trying to remap an undirected connective structure into a splitted outward and inward arrow, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, I think splitting the undirected arrow is like I think, in my view, I think that's close to what it means to treat a point.
Yeah, that's a nice insight.
Yeah, it's like figuring out how your interaction is, how it comes back. Like, what is the, roughly speaking, what is the reward and the cost structure?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was gonna say. Like, I mean, it seems like her main issue from what we began presenting is how do I turn an undirected connector that is just composing things together, like everyone is using air, into a reward and cost function, which is something going outward and something going inward, right? I mean, it's not really that, because the reward is the return, the feedback. The problem is that the feedback only has the reward and not the cost, right? Both are inward, like both are the return information, but for some reason it's hard to decompose or to split these undirected connectors into interventions and feedbacks, such that the feedbacks actually are capturing the proper information from the undirected arrows, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you get a bad signal on the feed. The arrow coming back can be a poor signal, noisy. And so the key is, how do you make that a more refined exploration maybe of that system.
And it's very interesting.
Yeah, so in this view, it's not necessarily games. I mean, you can't really say that the food system is playing a game with the climate system. It doesn't really make sense, but
you could say it's playing a game with your life, but
you maybe at the individual level you're playing a game with the world, but these systems are too big to do that.
But just to say something very quick about what we were just talking about, this sort of gamification of work, gamification of, like you mentioned food, and Luisa is using an app for like a diet and turns like that diet into a game. It's very much like that. It turns this sort of use of resources and tries to capture it into an intervention and a feedback structure that actually captures all the information you need, right? Like gamification is a sort of intra-capitalist sort of structured strategy today to do exactly that.
Yeah.
For example, turn cooperation, which is in our original idea, sort of undirected, right, into two directed arrows.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like every time you buy something with this credit card, we'll plant a tree. I mean, that's like a way that they try to turn intervention in climate change into like a game, right?
Yeah. That's interesting. Sorry.
It's also it made a lot clearer to me, like that statement that like our framework is supposed to be like a infinitely more rich space. Like it made more sense to me because like in both the firm, like the firm and the state, they seem to start with like adding a negative constraint on the space of possible actions. Like one is true. So the firm starts with some sort of enclosure, right? So it's a way of disconnecting other like players, the actions of other players. You just disconnect them. So that's how it's a big constraint on the space of possible actions, right? You're able to disconnect them, their access to the resource. And the state is also like a big negative constraint, but it's like a potential version of dispossession in which people are just threatened to be like punished in some way. So it's some sort of like preemptive power on the action of the others. So if you lift these two like negative constraints, you're left with all like the space of kind of like coordination and trust, and which doesn't come for free. Like it's not that you need to like materially build those channels because they like it makes also sense from like the synergy discussion, because like it to build like trust, some sort of like synergetic thing, it actually requires more like some sort of work and the material means to kind of like code this information, while like the state and private property constraints seems to, they're not really information, they're about like adding some sort of noise to the other channels of like other people.
And that's a very good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, it's exactly this thing of you have these unconstrained space, and then you're kind of investigating what constraints to put on, like because eventually you will put new constraints, right? But these constraints will now be kind of shaped by the resource and by those who are benefiting from the resource, rather than from like some kind of in the case of capital, like constraint by surplus extraction. Like we talked about how labor is transformed by capital to maximize surplus value. So everything that's not essential to increasing surplus is thrown away, right? You're filtering out only the things that increase profit and so on. So yeah, you're kind of throwing out those behaviors. So then that creates the site of revolt, by labor and so on, or like reorganizing that space of behaviors. But yeah, in this case, if you have, but it's still, yeah, you do need to deal with the fact that you're in, you'll need to still deal with the existence of the state and the existence of firms as well, but they're somehow like externalized. But yeah, that's, I mean, I think that would be another topic, which would be how your system interacts with not only the resource, but also with the state and with firms that are like you own, let's say you and your community owns the lake, but downstream, like there's a river that goes to the lake. At the end of the river, there's a firm that is dumping pollution into the river. So yeah, there's not a clear connect. I mean, because you live in the capitalist world, you have to deal with that problem as well. Like the constraints of that will pass on to you. And yeah, in the case of this picture, like climate system, it's like the ultimate example of the connectivity of all the constraints, right? There's the ultimate constraint passing, right? You're passing constraints like crazy from one area to another, one part to another. Yeah, I'll end on here. I guess we're at the end. But this slide here, I just wrote down some problems that people have identified after Ostrom regarding the scaling up. So yeah, on the left is kind of a critique of where Ostrom doesn't scale appropriately. So all of Ostrom's examples are kind of local. And then on the right, you have this author Stern wrote down some modifications to the design principles. But it's kind of obvious, I don't know. Some of it, yeah, like large scales, collective interests diverge. different ideologies. I'm not really sure this is helpful for us, but
it does suggest that in the literature around Ostrom, kind of this sort of limits of communitarian logic, they are the main source of criticism, right? Ideology, interests diverge, direct experience is no longer feasible. And it's interesting to me because, like, she focuses on the firm, but the firm is, let's say, the least market part of the market, right? As we've seen, like the interior of the firm actually has a different structure, and it concerns private property versus public property. But and you can talk about firms versus the state to exemplify the distinction between private and public. But commodity logic is not just the private logic, right? It's actually common to both public and private. When the state owns something, it does a lot of financial operations on top of those things as well. So it's interesting that the fact that the money structure and is a sort of global correlate of where firms are local, right? Money is sensing that you're losing something. It is kind of a criteria for rewards and costs, but it's not simply a local criteria, right? Because it's a memory criteria for every other endeavor, kind of that is offering the same kind of form of a corporation and so on, right? So it seems to me that, again, it goes back to our kind of, not a critique, but a kind of extension of Karatani to this more economic look at free association and less gift-based view of this mode D, right? Because the whole problem of removing counter gifts is that it's very nice in terms of alienation, in terms of emancipatory connections with other people, but it's not really accounting for the fact that all the other three have forward and backward movements, plunder and redistribution, right? Production and circulation, gift and reciprocity, because the backward channel, the backprop channel, right, brings the information from the totality, so you can actually scale to some point. The moment that you want to talk about gifts with no reciprocity, it's good ethically, it's perhaps tells a nice story in terms of the history of socialist ideas, but it might be solving it the wrong way, because if we're interested in, let's say, finding ways to treat, right, to split these undirected connections that compose common spaces into forward and backward passes, right? You need to have something to name with that backward pass, because that's what guarantees a sort of global view. If you don't have that, you might solve it locally, but then you cannot scale up, right? I think the experimentation version, if anything, it has that going for it. It's a name of a forward and a backward relation that retranslates something common, but in terms of information and interventions that you can still talk about connecting it with others and other endeavors, right? Like Karatani's actual examples are like stock exchange in a communist sense and cooperatives. Like he's not like talking about being just ethical and so on, but the way that he describes mode D kind of invisibilizes a bit that aspect of it, right? And it seems that in the critiques to Ostrom, it's that sort of channels for, like, her solutions for addressing the cost reward relation, trust, monitoring, so on. They don't hold when you start looking at it beyond this sort of reciprocity structure, right? Which is a counter kind of channel, right?
Yeah, let me think about that. I mean, yeah, does it? I think on some sense, the problems are still valid. I think she did not find any examples. It's
Yeah.
really hard to find examples of outside of the community logic, the communitarian logic, right?
Yeah.
But I think even at the global scale, I mean, these problems are pretty much still
Yeah, no,
hold,
yeah.
Yeah, and so like, is it really a feature of the gift counter gift logic? Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
because at
you're
first
right, though.
at first I thought that she was doing something like saying these common resources require a sort of prosthetic supplement so that we can actually sense their variations, because they are collective, they're not individual. So we need to add that feature, almost like a communitarian prosthesis, right? But it's still communitarian in the sense that no new normative principle. I mean, that's what I'm trying to understand. Like, are these design principles something like the commons, the problem of the commons viewed from this perspective of communities, right? That's how these statements of the commons exist as the problem of boundary, the problem of benefits and costs, the problem of monitoring. Like, are those problems already formulated from a commitment to the idea that they are solved by communitarian management? Or are these the most general statement, most general version of these problems, you know?
Yeah.
Because if they are the restricted version to a sort of, I'm already assuming that it's a community that is going to solve it, and therefore it's formulating in ways that a community can solve, right? It's not going to formulate the problem of the commons in a way that the community itself cannot solve them. So if it's already formulated from that perspective, well, if you scale it to a place where there is no community, no shared interest, no etc., well, then they become unsolvable, right? But because they're just formulated in a more specific situation, that you see my question, like,
yeah. I think it's interesting because it's like, what is the definition of community when we get to scales like this forest? I mean, I'm sure there's like many communities, right, that are working on this forest or like impacted by this forest. Same thing when we get to like the food system and the climate system. Like maybe the whole scaling thing is just a matter of it's whatever organization or form of organization is able to talk to the system, right?
Yeah, I mean, I just say this because historically the communitarian form only manages to cover very, very, very big territories if it is mediated by other forms, like the imperial form or the capitalist state form, and then you form the nation. So there are very, very, very big communities that go to war due to their resources, right? But they go to war in a world where these resources are already typified as the natural resources of a territory that belongs to a nation, which is a value that will guarantee employment and so on, right? It's not in the sense that she's looking at these resources, right? I don't think we have examples of very large scale communitarian dealings with common resources that are not mediated by state and capital, because those are the forms that allow you to act on such a high scale, right? Like military protection of something, right? So
yeah, definitely, yeah. You're still nested in. I mean, you're still in the multi-layer transcendental where one of those is dominant. It's not like mode D is dominant there. It's you're kind of a subsystem of the state or capital.
And I think that perhaps, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that this is it's it's such an interesting thing. So it's hard to. I would really want to understand a bit better how this, let's say, iterated games and her design principles and the way that she addresses like these case studies, how these things fit together, because it might clarify a bit what's like the really essential thing going on, you know. But from this abstract perspective where I'm seeing it now, I mean, my point is, I would probably translate at a global scale the problem of, you know, cost and reward back into the very old problem we were dealing with like a long time ago. Remember when we had that idea that the whole problem boils down to this, right? I do something, something is done to this, something is done to this, but nothing guarantees that this will go back to me, right? Like, some action is done here under some organizational principle, some action is done here, but nothing guarantees that I will get back something for my investment in some political experiment, that I will get some help or solidarity will come back to me. Like, that seems the very, and we were comparing this to commodities, where the very fact that B accepts some money from me, he only accepts because he knows C will accept from him, and C only accepts money from him because he knows I will accept from him, right? Like, this is it already presupposes that this is possible, which already presupposes that this is possible. So when I pay somebody with money, I know that I will be paid with money as well, and I'll get back something from it, right? Things like, I know it's a consistent thing, whereas Mode D seems to have this problem. Like, this is like a gift without a counter gift. This is a gift without a counter gift, but who said that I'm gonna get something back? Like, her problem seems to be a localized version of this sort of issue, right? I might know in the short term that this is the best behavior in some situation, but nothing, I don't have the means of knowing that this is the case in the future, for example, or that other people will behave with regards to me in the way that I'm behaving with regards to them, in terms of the free rider problem, for example, right? Yeah. Like, it all, in my opinion, it all comes back, like, in the very general sense, to this issue of, which I think is what qualifies as the economic dimension of our approach. What sort of local principle can function as a signal of a non-local consistency amongst those actions, right? So building solidarity, acquiring a memory, all those things move towards that kind of problem. Like, how can we, what can make different interventions consist with one another, right? And then if you take it even further, it becomes a problem of reproduction. Like, working in the benefit of that, he's working the benefit of that other thing, but what guarantees that I'm also gonna survive, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I can see the connection between the way, like, I think at least it would be possible to show that if you constrain the problem to situations where communities are a site, her principles are, let's say, coherent with our general problem. I think that that's the least you can show, and I think it's quite easy to show from what you presented. And then there is a stronger claim, which is they actually enrich her description of the general problem, right? Which I think it's also happening there, but it's a bit more ambiguous, perhaps, because the conditions for those problems to appear under those terms of trust, you know, monitoring and so on, they might be more restricted to the situation where the common emergence through communities, right? Which is something I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, definitely I mean, it's a really hard question to tackle now, but definitely, like, the phrase that Cartani uses of, you know, mode D is mode A returned in this higher level, that does seem to suggest that, at least from Cartani's perspective, it's like the prosthetic counter gift counter gift thing is kind of close to his vision of it, right? Like, yeah, if you could create something that functioned like, because I understand, yeah, so you have this missing reward structure. It's not transitive or whatever. Like you act on the environment, but then the cost is paid by somebody else somewhere else. You never feel the cost, or you do the work, you never get the reward, right? You put in the work, but you don't. It doesn't come back to you.
Yeah, you don't pollute, but you have no way of knowing others are not polluting.
Yeah, and then something like a prosthetic, an eye, something makes that connection for you. So then you, using that thing, like via surrogate reasoning or whatever you want to call it, you are able to act as if you're in the same community as everybody else on a global level. And then you can act as if you're going to get something back that's proportional to what you put in. But yeah, I guess it becomes an impossible thing to ask, like what that thing is and how it would function. But it does seem to be like a translation of Karatani's statement that mode A returns at a higher level. Yeah, but I think what you're suggesting is also like, what if the parameter there is like, it's not so much that you act as if now everyone's in the same community, but there's something else that's allowing you to think this.
I'm not sure I'm completely following, but I had the impression that like solving the problem of the commons, that from the kind of internal point of view, so say people inside the community, so when they're able to kind of like solve it and build some source of trust that allows for like a common resource to be shared, it seems to be like a necessary condition for scaling up and kind of like repeating the process at a higher scale. Like, so
right,
say,
yeah,
once you're able, as a cooperative, you're able to kind of like internally function and function, like share some sort of like means of production. And then but you can use different principles to solve that internally, but nothing like guarantees that the principle you use, like some sort of like trust in your colleagues instead of some sort of like formal like property of the means of production. But in any case, like it seems to be like a necessary condition for you to be able to kind of like lift into the higher order. So how would then the cooperative relate to other cooperative? Like it seems to be a necessary condition that they function as one cooperative, right? That they are able to share a resource, because so sharing a resource seems to be like a condition for something from the outside be treated as one, like for it to, in some sort of like ecology of organizations, for them to relate in a consistent way, like a necessary condition seems to be that this problem of the common be solved at this first level, so that you can kind of like treat it as the next sort of atom for. So I think, I'm not sure if it relates, but I think it seems like it's a necessary condition, but nothing guarantees that the principle you use to solve it will be kind of like repeated at the next level. Like,
actually I think this is the best way to think of it. Yeah, it's like, instead of trying to think of what is the one thing that makes the cost and benefit structure visible at the global level, I think it should be thought of as this like bottom up approach. Let's say like every organization sees a particular structure, cost benefit structure, or is able to see that resource. And then when you connect two organizations together, it's almost like forming a new resource, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I see.
It's like creating synthetic resources or politically synthetic, that
Yeah,
then
in
it's
in this sense, it's passing from directed arrows to undirected.
exactly. And
Yeah.
it fits perfectly with the whole system environment thing. Like when you become the environment when you are the thing that everything else has to connect to, right?
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
organizations connect together, then they become more and more, they become the environment.
Yeah, there's something profound there. I think more about it, but that's a really
Yeah.
cool idea.
That's as good of a result
Yes,
as you can hope for.
Yeah.
There's something profound there.
Guys, I need to go. I need to cook. But this was amazing, Dennis. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Are you still going to present on the theory of the firm?
Yeah, I plan to, but I think I need to take a break because I read too much stuff here, like
Man, no,
so
but
much literature.
Man, I mean, one thing, if you're up for it at some point, like I really want to understand a bit better, like how this iteration of game, like the composition of the game into many games, how this affects those three problems, like
Yeah,
that
I don't know
seems so-
much about it.
Yeah, I really want to.
It's really important. Yeah, like iterated game. Yeah, like changes the game completely. But yeah, it's
Yeah, I'm gonna look into
it's
that.
not good.
Not the Investopedia.
Version.
Yeah, but
Yeah, I think this was actually one of the reasons that, or one of the things that inspired open games was it's kind of normal game theory. It's awkward to treat these problems. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I'll think about it.
Good meeting.
Guys, see you later.
All right, take care, everyone.
Guys.
Bye-bye.